When most people think of Chinese emperors, they picture silk robes, golden palaces, and wise rulers guiding the Middle Kingdom with unmatched brilliance. But what if I told you that many of these so-called sons of heaven were less enlightened philosophers and more overgrown toddlers with crowns? Would you trust a ruler who drank mercury potions, hoping to live forever, only to die from his own medicine? Or a monarch who thought bathing in the blood of virgins was a reasonable beauty treatment? History books love to praise China for its walls, inventions, and art. But how often do they mention the emperor who abandoned government affairs to binge in brothels? Or the one who disguised himself as a thug just to harass commoners for fun? Some gorged themselves on feasts while their starving subjects looked on. Others wasted fortunes building palaces that made Las Vegas look humble. Tonight, we'll peel back the silk curtain and reveal the sickening secrets of China's most twisted emperors. After this, you may never look at dynasties the same way again. Before we dive into the filth, quick question for you. If you were emperor, what would be your most disgusting habit? Drop it in the comments. And if this kind of twisted history makes you smirk, give the video a like so the algorithm knows you're as disturbed as we are. Let's start at the very beginning, with the man who thought he could outsmart death itself. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, united warring states, built the foundations of the Great Wall, and created a dynasty that changed history. Pretty impressive resume, right? But behind the stone soldiers and monumental walls was a man so obsessed with immortality that he turned his body into a toxic waste dump. Imagine ruling the largest empire of your age with riches and power beyond imagination and still being terrified of one tiny problem: dying. Qin Shi Huang summoned alchemists, charlatans, and quacks who promised him eternal life in the form of elixirs. These elixirs usually contained mercury, arsenic, and other poisons, basically the ancient equivalent of chugging battery acid. The emperor guzzled them anyway, convinced each sip was a ticket to immortality. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. And he wasn't just paranoid about death, he was paranoid about everyone. Qin Shi Huang would order tunnels built so he could travel unseen, terrified that assassins lurked around every corner. He even ordered entire libraries burned, erasing knowledge that didn't flatter him, as if controlling books could control his destiny. The irony? After all his desperate measures, the man who dreamed of eternity died at just 49 years old, killed by his own obsession. The same mercury meant to save him likely poisoned his brain, making him even more unstable in his final years. The first emperor of China, the so-called immortal, ended up as a tragic cautionary tale. Absolute power doesn't conquer mortality, it just accelerates the madness. If you thought Qin Shi Huang poisoning himself with mercury was ridiculous, wait until you meet a ruler who thought sacrificing people was a perfectly reasonable hobby. Han Wudi, who reigned during the Western Han dynasty, is often praised as a strong and ambitious emperor. He expanded China's borders, centralized power, and made Confucianism the official ideology. Sounds noble, right? But peel back the propaganda and you'll find a man obsessed with the supernatural, willing to spill blood in search of eternal youth. Wudi wasn't content with the usual luxuries of palace life. He hunted for magicians and shamans who promised to open gateways to the afterlife, brewing potions that could cheat death. When those potions didn't work, he turned to darker methods. Sacrificial rituals became a part of his reign, with humans offered up like gifts to the gods. Imagine being a peasant, dragged into a palace not to serve dinner, but to become it, offered to the heavens in the name of the emperor's paranoia. And it wasn't just the blood rituals. Wudi's court was a circus of excess. He drained the treasury on endless military campaigns, funded by heavy taxes that crushed ordinary farmers. While his people struggled, Wudi poured resources into building massive palaces and supporting quack alchemists. The empire grew, but so did resentment. His search for immortality left China exhausted and unstable, setting the stage for chaos after his death. The irony is almost comical. Wudi lived to 70, an impressive age for the ancient world, not because of his poisons and sacrifices, but despite them. He spent his final years paranoid and bitter, haunted by the very rituals he once believed would save him. His obsession with living forever didn't grant him peace. It made him one of the bloodiest and most exhausting rulers in Chinese history. But if blood rituals and paranoia sound extreme, just wait. Our next emperor believed government positions should be sold off like trinkets at a yard sale. Emperor Ling of Han ruled from 168 to 189 AD, and if you were looking for a good government job back then, you didn't need qualifications, you just needed a fat wallet. Ling perfected the art of selling official posts to the highest bidder. Want to be a judge? Pay up. Dream of commanding an army? Write a check. He basically ran the imperial court like an eBay store, except instead of rare coins, he auctioned off entire provinces. Of course, when you sell power to the greedy and incompetent, the results are catastrophic. Corruption spread like wildfire. Officials who bought their titles didn't care about governing. They only wanted to squeeze back the money they had spent, usually by taxing peasants into misery. The empire became less about law and order and more about who could bribe the emperor hardest. Ling himself? He wasn't exactly living a monk's life. He drowned in lavish banquets, surrounded himself with concubines, and partied like there was no tomorrow, because for him, tomorrow always came with another payday. The empire was collapsing under its own corruption, but Ling barely noticed, too busy cashing in and indulging his pleasures. The result? His rule left China weakened and resentful, setting the stage for the Yellow Turban Rebellion, one of the largest peasant uprisings in history. Ironically, the same peasants who funded his luxurious lifestyle were the ones who rose up against him. Ling's legacy isn't wisdom, conquest, or glory. It's the reminder that when your government is for sale, your empire is already bankrupt. And if you think selling government jobs was stupid, wait until you meet an emperor so clueless he made Marie Antoinette look like a genius chef. Emperor Puyi of Qin, who reigned from 290 to 307 AD, is remembered less as a ruler and more as a punchline. While China was fracturing into chaos, he became legendary for his breathtaking stupidity. His most famous moment? When told that peasants were starving because there was no rice, he innocently asked, "Why don't they just eat meat?" Sound familiar? Move over, Marie Antoinette. Wei was centuries ahead in cluelessness. Wei's incompetence wasn't limited to tone-deaf comments. The court became a playground for scheming regents and ruthless family members who used the emperor like a puppet. He had no grasp of statecraft, no interest in leadership, and no ability to resist manipulation. Ministers jockeyed for power while the empire bled from endless civil wars. Hui just sat on his throne, blissfully unaware, like a child left alone in a candy shop, except the candy was political chaos. He did have his indulgences, though. Banquets piled high with delicacies were his comfort, even as the empire starved. He entertained himself with trivial games while warlords carved up China outside his palace walls. In essence, Emperor Hui was the kind of leader who fiddled with toys while his empire quite literally burned. The result was the devastating War of the Eight Princes, where rival royals tore the dynasty apart, while Hui remained a silent, smiling spectator. By the time he died, the empire was weakened beyond repair, all because the man at the top couldn't tell hunger from luxury. If you thought Emperor Hui was clueless, get ready for a ruler who knew exactly what he wanted: endless palaces, constant orgies, and someone else footing the bill. Emperor Yang of Sui, 569–618 AD, had the kind of ambition that could build a legacy, or in his case, bury an empire. On paper, he was bold. He expanded China's borders, built massive infrastructure projects like the Grand Canal, and centralized power. Sounds impressive, until you realize he treated the empire less like a nation and more like his personal casino. Yang was obsessed with luxury. He commissioned palaces so extravagant they made previous dynasties look modest. Imagine Disneyland, but instead of rides, there were chambers for drinking, feasting, and every imaginable indulgence. His harem grew into a small city of concubines, and his parties were the kind that would put Roman emperors to shame. He paraded his women across artificial lakes on boats shaped like dragons, enjoying the show while peasants were taxed to the bone to pay for it all. But Yang's appetite wasn't limited to women and wine. He threw men and money into disastrous military campaigns, including failed invasions of Korea that killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. While his troops froze and starved, Yang remained wrapped in silk sheets, surrounded by entertainers. The people's resentment boiled over. Taxes were unbearable, conscription endless, and the emperor's extravagance impossible to ignore. Rebellions erupted across the empire, and before long, Yang found himself despised not only by his subjects, but by his own generals. In the end, he was strangled to death by his closest allies. Poetic justice for a man who built his reign on exploitation and excess. And if you think Yang's dragon boats and orgies were outrageous, wait until you hear about the next emperor who collected women like trading cards and ignored the empire while he drowned in pleasure. Emperor Ai of Tang, 892–908 AD, didn't inherit much. By his time, the dynasty was already crumbling, but he made sure to leave behind a reputation for pure indecency. While warlords carved up the empire, Emperor Ai was busy inventing new ways to humiliate his court in the name of pleasure. He is remembered less as a statesman and more as the man who thought public office was just foreplay. One of his favorite pastimes was forcing courtiers and officials into bizarre sexual games, often stripping them naked and tying them up for entertainment. This wasn't whispered scandal, it was daily life in his palace. The throne room, once a place of ritual and ceremony, became a stage for debauchery. Instead of being rewarded for loyalty or merit, officials were chosen based on how much amusement they could provide to their emperor. Of course, such behavior didn't come cheap. Ai drained the imperial treasury to fund his extravagances, showering his favorites with gifts, silk, and gold. Meanwhile, the empire outside his palace was falling apart. Rebellions raged, famines spread, and provinces broke away. But inside, the emperor only wanted more games, more wine, and more humiliation to fill his days. His reign was short-lived. Tang China was already dying, and Emperor Ai's grotesque negligence only hastened the collapse. By the time he was dethroned, the dynasty was finished, remembered not just for its cultural brilliance, but also for an emperor who turned governance into a grotesque cabaret. And if you think Ai's palace games were stomach-turning, wait until you meet a Ming emperor who dressed up like a street thug just to terrorize his own people. Emperor Zhengde of the Ming dynasty, 1491–1521 AD, was born into unimaginable privilege, but apparently wearing the dragon robes and ruling the empire wasn't thrilling enough. Instead, he created his own private street gang filled with cronies who joined him in drunken adventures, reckless hunts, and nightly escapades that terrorized his own people. Imagine the ruler of the most powerful country on earth sneaking out of the palace in disguise, only to pick fights in taverns. Zhengde adored costumes. Sometimes he dressed as a common soldier, other times as a shopkeeper, and often as a thug. But no matter the disguise, his favorite game was chaos. He would storm into markets, overturn stalls, and even abduct women under the guise of adventure. For the emperor, it was entertainment. For the citizens, it was a nightmare. His imperial guards followed along, ensuring nobody dared to resist. Of course, the palace itself wasn't much better. Zhengde turned it into a zoo, literally. He collected exotic animals including leopards, tigers, and even camels, parading them through the gardens like carnival attractions. Combined with his drinking, gambling, and womanizing, the court became less an imperial capital and more a circus with him as the drunken ringmaster. The cost of his antics was staggering. While officials tried to govern, Zhengde's negligence weakened defenses and strained finances. The empire endured foreign threats and internal unrest, while the emperor was busy pretending to be a bandit. His reign ended abruptly when, after a night of drunken excess, he fell into a lake during a hunting trip and died shortly after. Not exactly the glorious end of a son of heaven. And if dressing up like a thug and drowning in booze sounds disgraceful, wait until you hear about a Ming emperor who believed the secret to immortality was drinking the blood of virgins. If you thought Zhengde's drunken thug cosplay was disgraceful, wait until you meet an emperor who decided blood was the ultimate skincare routine. Emperor Jiajing, 1507–1567 AD, had a reign that started with promise, but quickly descended into one of the most bizarre and disturbing chapters in Chinese history. Obsessed with Taoist immortality practices, Jiajing became convinced that youth and eternal life could be stolen from others, specifically from young girls. He kept dozens of them in the palace and forced them to provide their menstrual blood and urine for alchemical elixirs. Yes, you read that right. The most powerful man in China was essentially running a twisted vampire cult inside the Forbidden City. But it didn't stop at blood. Jiajing's palace became a laboratory of grotesque experiments. Taoist priests concocted potions with toxic herbs, mercury, and the bodily fluids of terrified young servants, while the emperor consumed them with religious devotion. These concoctions made him sick, paranoid, and increasingly detached from reality, but he believed each sip brought him closer to godhood. Meanwhile, governance? Forget it. While Jiajing sat in his chambers drinking blood and chanting incantations, corruption exploded across the empire. Famine and uprisings spread, while eunuchs and officials lined their pockets unchecked. The emperor occasionally emerged from his ritual chambers to punish dissent, but his cruelty only deepened resentment. Even his victims eventually snapped. In 1542, a group of palace women tried to strangle him in his sleep, furious at years of abuse and exploitation. The assassination attempt failed, but it revealed just how hated he had become, even by those trapped in his inner court. Jiajing lived to his 60s, which he probably credited to his disgusting potions, though in reality it was sheer luck. His legacy wasn't divine immortality, but the image of an emperor so lost in superstition and cruelty that he turned vampirism into state policy. If you thought drinking blood was grotesque, wait until you meet an emperor who turned hoarding into a national crisis. Emperor Qianlong in 1711–1799 AD is often celebrated as one of China's longest reigning monarchs. Under his rule, the Qing dynasty reached its peak in territory and culture. But behind the glorious image was a ruler with an insatiable obsession for stuff. Not ideas, not reforms, not even women, just stuff. Qianlong collected everything: paintings, calligraphy, jade, porcelain, clocks, even foreign trinkets brought by traders. His palaces became storage warehouses overflowing with treasures. At first, this might sound like a refined passion. But Qianlong wasn't just a connoisseur, he was a compulsive hoarder. He commissioned endless catalogues to list his possessions, sometimes writing self-congratulatory poems on the art he acquired. And by acquired, we often mean confiscated. If he wanted it, it was his. End of story. Of course, hoarding wasn't cheap. The emperor drained massive resources to satisfy his collecting mania. Meanwhile, his later reign grew increasingly corrupt. He indulged his favorite officials, who plundered the empire while he admired his porcelain bowls. By the time he was old, the once mighty Qing dynasty was rotting from within. Qianlong's obsession with appearances also played a role in disaster. He loved extravagance, parading his wealth while ignoring pressing problems like population strain and foreign threats. For a man who supposedly valued eternity, he left behind an empire entering decline, weighed down by excess and arrogance. And the irony? Despite his treasure mountains, Qianlong is remembered less as a wise curator and more as the emperor who drowned China in luxury while letting decay seep through the cracks. If you thought Qianlong's porcelain hoarding was pathetic, wait until you meet the last emperor of China, a man who traded the dragon throne for an opium pipe. Puyi, 1906-1967, ascended to the throne at the age of 2, which already tells you everything you need to know. China's last son of heaven was still in diapers when he inherited an empire on the verge of collapse. Imagine a toddler as head of state. It wasn't just symbolic, it was tragicomic. Court officials ruled in his name, while the child emperor was groomed for power he would never actually hold. As he grew older, Puyi became less an emperor and more a living museum piece. The Qing dynasty fell in 1912, but he was allowed to keep living in the Forbidden City as a private monarch, surrounded by eunuchs and servants who indulged his every whim. He developed a taste for excess, lavish clothes, Western gadgets, and especially opium. By the time he was a young man, the once mighty ruler of China was reduced to a drug addict, chain-smoking his way through exile. His downfall didn't stop there. Puyi was later installed by the Japanese as a puppet ruler of Manchukuo, a fake empire created to serve Tokyo's ambitions. In reality, he was nothing more than a marionette, paraded around in ceremonial robes while foreign officers pulled every string. From emperor to puppet, from throne to humiliating prop, his decline was complete. After World War II, he was captured by the Soviets, then handed over to the new communist regime in China. Puyi lived out his final years as a common citizen, working as a gardener and writing memoirs that revealed just how powerless he had always been. The boy who once ruled an empire ended his life planting flowers, his dynasty gone, his glory long forgotten. And that, dear viewer, is how the great line of emperors ended, not with a roar, but with the wheeze of an opium smoker. From Qin Shi Huang's mercury cocktails to Puyi's opium haze, China's emperors left behind more than monuments and dynasties. They left behind the smell of rot. For every triumph in walls, art and governance, there were grotesque habits that remind us power is rarely clean. These men believed themselves divine, but their actions exposed something deeply human: vanity, greed, lust, paranoia, and a shocking lack of self-control. What do we learn from 2,000 years of twisted rulers? That empires are not destroyed only by invading armies or collapsing economies. They can be poisoned from within by the very men who sit on the throne. When leaders confuse indulgence with immortality, or pleasure with governance, the result is always the same: decay. And here's the real question: are these emperors unique, or do we still see echoes of them today? Leaders who gorge themselves while their people suffer, who hoard wealth, or who cling to power long after they've lost touch with reality. History doesn't just repeat, it festers. So, next time you hear about the glory of emperors, remember the sickening secrets they tried to hide. And ask yourself, what would you have done with the dragon throne?